Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Josh, and we're your farm management hosts. Let's get started.
Well, Josh, it's about that spring fever time of year. We're all going to get sick of winter. Does that mean we got spring fever? Is that what that means when you're maybe the itching to get out into the garden a little bit? In fact, I was out over the weekend and turned out to be a little crummier weather than I had anticipated, but the spring fever was still strong and did some pruning and cleanup and things like that. Have you gotten the illness yet, Josh?
Bruce, I think we just went through our fake spring and now we went back to winter and now we're going back to spring. Hopefully it's going to stick this time. We've got a couple raised beds here at the extension office where I went ahead and started putting some of them cool season vegetables in, put some peas in, put some lettuce in, trying to get those ready for May. In May, we typically have a big ag day that comes out to the office. So I like to work with those kids and let them do that raised bed. But yeah, I am really itching to get out, get the gardens ready. And like you know, I love vegetables on the grill. So I am really itching for some good weather where I can sit out, get the grill fired up, maybe smoke some meats. That is what I'm living for. What about you, Bruce? What are you really looking forward to this spring?
Very similar. I follow some people on social media and I see their videos, and it's maybe warmer sometimes in other places, and they're out doing things ahead of maybe where I'm at in northern Ohio. So I'm itching. I'm looking forward to planting some small fruit production plants this spring. You know, that those brambles, which would be raspberries and blackberries, and just getting ready for spring planting and watching our alfalfa fields warm up and kind of kick off with growth and see where 2025 takes us. So that's going to be great. Well, speaking of kind of a startup for the season, today we're going to be talking about the effects of starter phosphorus fertilizer on yield and the economic parts of that. So we have a great speaker today with us. Kendall Lovejoy is a colleague of Josh and I's, and Kendall is a A&R, Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator in Fulton County, which is in northern Ohio. He has a background focusing in field crops, but also in swine production. And we love it because he really enjoys looking at the numbers as well. So, Kendall, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bruce and Josh. Appreciate it. This is an honor, truthfully.
Well, we're going to get started. And before we get rolling, let's make sure everybody's on the same page as far as listeners. And we are going to talk about starter fertilizer, especially phosphorus and the research that you've been doing. Let's define what that means for our listeners related to your research and the findings that you're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so when we consider starter fertilizer, this is traditionally a practice that I would associate, at least in Northwest Ohio and Fulton County, with starter fertilizer going down with corn. And so with the corn planter, traditionally a liquid fertilizer is predominantly what we're going to be talking about. Now, we can see starter fertilizer in other crops such as wheat, and maybe that comes in the form of a granular. But for the sake of my research and some of the stuff that I've been doing here locally, it's going to be corn fertilizer, corn starter fertilizer, that's being applied 2x2. So there's also a lot of work by some colleagues of mine that's being done with in-furrow research. But when we're talking about just traditional fertilizers and some of the liquid products that we would typically see in a starter fertilizer blend, 28%, 10-30-4-0, some of these have really concerns with the salt content in furrow situations. And so my focus and my research here that we'll be sharing and talking about this morning or this afternoon, whenever you're getting to listen to this, is focused on that 2x2 placement.
Kendall, this is a really good topic I'm really interested in. When we're looking at those farmers, sometimes money can be tight. What economic trends do you see that can make this discussion and this research really important?
Great question, Josh. And now is really a great time to take a step back maybe for the grower and look at where are we headed? Where have we been economically and where are we headed? And so when we look at the phosphorus markets as a whole, specifically if we just take a look at MAP, over the last 3 years, we've seen a wide variety of prices and a pretty significant change in the volatility of that product. Back in 2022, we were as clear high as almost $1,100 a ton for that product. And now in 2024, as we closed out the year, we're sitting right around $800 a ton. And so we've seen a stark increase in price. Now we're starting to see that price come down. And as we look at the overall fertilizer prices over the last year or so, specifically in 2024 and our phosphorus products, we can see that our prices have remained pretty well flat. I really like to refer to our quarterly fertilizer prices survey that's conducted by our OSU colleagues, Amanda Bennett, Eric Rieker, Clint Schrader. Done a really nice job at putting together this document that comes out each quarter. What we do with this survey is that we send it out to our local retailers all across the state of Ohio, predominantly the western side of the state, and we get their price direct from the plant, whether it's free on board from the plant or direct to farm ship, just depending on the product. And we get their price and we average them out. And so we'll receive anywhere from 5 to 20 responses, just depending on the product. And it really gives us a good picture as to what our growers are paying locally out of pocket for their fertilizer prices. So when we look at the last 5 quarters of our phosphate products specifically, when we look at our phosphate products, we can see that they're pretty well flat. And so this is maybe some good news for the farmer, but it's also important to note that on the flip side of things, fertilizer is not just the whole part of the equation, right? We also have to look at our revenue side. And when we look at our revenue and our commodity prices as a whole, we see a lot of volatility and a lot of fluctuation. Our corn markets and our soybean markets, respectively, have been all over the place. And so if you'll recall back, we said our fertilizer price in 2022 was pretty high. Our commodity price kind of fell with that. It was high in 22, but now as we're on the decline of our fertilizer prices, our grain prices are also on the decline as well. And so the fluctuation on both sides of the equation, whether it's a revenue or an expense, has really caused an overall dip in farm income, which is what causes concern for the grower as we look ahead in the 2025 growing season. Look at this dip in the farm income and how do we delegate that? How do we regulate that? And I think one of the opportunities for the farmer is to look at the fertilizer prices. Where can we maybe cut back or look at our recommendations for fertilizer and see if there's opportunity to bring that cost down? Because on the overall grand scheme of things, fertilizer can take anywhere from 20 to 25% of our total input costs. Look at the budget as a whole, fertilizer can make up 20 to 25% of that cost. And so really taking a time to evaluate that large category, that large expense, is worth doing for the grower.
So that's the economic side of it. So the agronomy side of this research, what are some of those agronomy theories that are behind the use of starter fertilizers that you used as a framework for your research and your presentations?
We know that phosphorus is immobile in the soil, that it's really important for our root and shoot growth. And so getting starter fertilizer down in the root zone, it can be really beneficial for those early seedling plants. But we also know that as the plant matures and progresses, it's really integral to the photosynthetic processes that plant undergoes. In relation to starter fertilizer, on top of that, not only is phosphorus beneficial, but starter fertilizer, we've seen that it can be really beneficial for those early seedlings. Some specific scenarios where we see starter fertilizer, or what history will tell us that starter fertilizer is more beneficial, is in scenarios where we have low soil temperatures, which with any spring, we're subject to that, right? We were talking about that earlier in this fluctuation of Ohio weather. Low soil temperatures can really help see the impact of starter fertilizer, as well as our low soil tests. And so if we have some nutrients that are lacking in that area or in that farm, the combination of that low soil temperature and that low soil test is often going to generate a yield response for us. Our Ohio Agronomy Guide will tell us that if we see a field that has a soil or a field that has moderate to high levels of soil test phosphorus and potassium, we're typically not going to see any benefit from that starter fertilizer, which is what really interests me about this research, because I would say anymore, starter fertilizer is almost a guarantee when we're looking at corn growers, specifically in Fulton County at least, but in Northwest Ohio and across Western Ohio. It's almost a guarantee that when you plant corn, you're going to have starter fertilizer going down with it.
So, Kendall, let's talk about location. Location. Usually one of the most important questions. When we're looking at this OSU crop response to phosphorus fertilizer, where's it being conducted for these Ohio growers?
Great question, Josh. And for me, a lot of my research that I've looked into and been a part of since my time in Extension started about 2 years ago has been here locally in Fulton County, but also in some of the neighboring counties as well, in Henry and Williams counties. But a lot of this research has been conducted all across the state of Ohio. When we look at some of our tri-state fertilizer recommendations and really the framework behind that recommendation, that research took place all across the state. Typically, we look at the western side of the state as being our crop production side of the state. If we had to put a stereotype on it, maybe, or break it down geographically, break the state down geographically. But predominantly, my research is focused in Northwest Ohio, and I think it presents a really unique aspect to it because we're located in that Western Lake Erie water basin, and this watershed is really focused on reducing our nutrient load on Lake Erie. And when we look at the nutrients, phosphorus specifically is one that's prone to maybe causing those harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. And so we want to be good stewards of that. And I think that's where I've received a lot of buy-in from growers who are focused on this work as well, because they don't want to see agriculture take a bad rap for the work that we're doing that we have to do in order to raise crops, right? And so taking a closer look at this research, making sure we're not over applying and evaluating where our nutrient levels are at has been a really big focus for growers in my area specifically. And I think that we're really seeing the rewards of that work in the long run as well.
So, Kendall, one side of the coin might say, well, what's the likelihood of having a yield penalty if I decide, given the scenario, to not apply phosphorus fertilizer or phosphorus starter fertilizer? Could there be a penalty? So, in your findings, what has been kind of the likelihood of a yield penalty if phosphorus fertilizer is not applied?
So when we look at our overall soil test levels, that's really where that question comes down to is what is your soil test level? Because then I'll be able to maybe answer that question a little bit better. Our phosphorus framework here in the tri-state area through the tri-state fertilizer guide suggests that soil test levels between 20 and 40 parts per million would be considered in the maintenance range. Any soil that falls in this range, we're not typically going to expect a yield advantage or a yield penalty if fertilizer is not applied here. Where we see the yield penalty side come into is when we see those soils drop below that 20 parts per million. When we look at our overall data set for our tri-state fertilizer guide recommendations, we can see that when our soil test phosphorus drops below 20 parts per million, we're seeing a greater response rate to that fertilizer amendment. And so when we look at our overall data set for the Ohio Tri-State Fertilizer Guide, we can see that when we fall below that 20 parts per million, that critical soil test phosphorus level is when we really see our greatest response to phosphorus fertilizer, especially when we fall below that 10 parts per million, those critically low soil test phosphorus values. That's traditionally when we're going to expect a yield penalty if we don't apply that phosphorus fertilizer. In our research, 67% of farms that fell below soil test phosphorus of 10 parts per million saw a yield increase as a result, or did see that benefit.
So, Kendall, how much of a yield increase can we expect whenever we look at applying that phosphorus?
That's a great question, Josh. And when I look at my localized data set of research, I've seen anywhere from a loss of a bushel to a gain of 10 bushel with the addition of starter phosphorus fertilizer. And so conditions really impact what that looks like, but overall, we can see up to a 10 bushel yield increase when you're applying that additional phosphorus fertilizer. But that all depends on your soil test phosphorus level. And so a lot of these farms that I was doing research in fell in that critical level where we would expect to see a yield increase. But when we have farms in that maintenance range, soil test phosphorus 20 to 40 parts per million, that's really when we don't expect to see a yield advantage. And in my research, we didn't see a yield advantage. And when we don't see a yield advantage, it doesn't really result in a profitable return for the farmer either.
So, Kendall, if you could walk us through some of your recent field trials that you looked at yield response to phosphorus, and then where you did see a phosphorus response, you've put some returns dollar values on that starter. Can you walk us through a couple of those projects, and then where can we find some of that information as well?
Certainly, Bruce. I've been new to this role in the last 2 years or so, and so I've done some really great work with some great partnerships across the state, and specifically here in Northwest Ohio, got a great group of folks called the Conservation Action Project, and these folks are really dedicated to looking at better ways to be stewards of the environment and the soils that we've been provided with. And so in partnership with the Conservation Action Project and with funding through a grant with H2 Ohio, we were able to conduct a lot of localized research on starter phosphorus fertilizer specifically. First couple trials I want to highlight happened right here in Fulton County. In 2023, we looked at 3 different farms with the grower that all had soil test phosphorus levels in that 18 to 20 parts per million. So what we would consider just barely in that critical range. We would expect to see a yield response from a phosphorus amendment here. When we look at those different trials, we can see that our planting dates were pretty similar, anywhere from May 14th to May 24th in that range. All of these farms were a no-till system, and traditionally in a no-till system, we would also expect to see a greater response to starter fertilizer and phosphorus fertilizer as well. In looking at those 3 fields in 2023, one of those farms did have a bushel loss, resulting in a $14 per acre loss. But the other 2 farms saw a pretty stark increase. They saw a 9 bushel per acre gain and a 10 bushel per acre gain, resulting in around a $20 premium per acre, or rather a return per acre on those farms. When we look at some more recent trials here in 2024, similar studies were conducted. But if you'll recall our weather in 2024, we were in a drought year. And so I have a feeling that this may have impacted the results that we saw. In 2024, we did the same trial, 0 phosphorus fertilizer with the addition of comparing that to starter phosphorus fertilizer. Our treatment was a 5 gallons of 1034O per acre. When we look at the results of that trials in 2024, similar to 2023, we didn't see any yield response. But what's really interesting about the 2024 trial is that our soil test phosphorus level was 14 parts per million, really, really critical. And so this is where we would expect to see a yield response. But in this specific study, we did not. Again, going back to our 2024 growing conditions, the drought definitely could have played an impact on our results in this trial. And then in 2024, we also went back and looked at year 2 of the study. And so if you'll recall, in 2023, we had no starter phosphorus fertilizer versus 5 gallons of 1034O. In 2024, what we did is did not apply any additional phosphorus fertilizer, but instead we planted soybeans over top of those same strips and then harvested them in those same strips as they were in 2023. Looking at the long-term effects, maybe that 1034O is a slow release or slow to break down. So we're looking to see if that impacted our bean crop in 2024. When we look at that research specifically, we did not see a significant yield increase with the addition of that phosphorus fertilizer the year prior. When we look at some of the different resources that are available to you to maybe look back on some of our research that I've conducted and my colleagues have conducted around the state, there's several great resources available to you to go look up these studies. Well, first one is our eFields publication. And so if you look up our 2024 eFields report, you'll see some of the recent ones that I was just discussing and some of the historical ones in 2023 as well. We also have a website that's maybe not as well known or related, but it's where we publish our on-farm research reports. And these are maybe what are called white papers. And these are some really statistically heavy and data heavy reports that maybe aren't as farmer friendly or visually friendly, but there's a lot of really great data within them. And so I strongly encourage you to look up our Ohio State University on-farm research reports or going to our eFields report as well through the Digital Ag program, where you can find lots more data regarding this and many other great projects conducted by myself and my colleagues around the state.
Kendall, a lot of good information you just had right there. I really liked how you emphasized using those e-fields. I know as an extension educator in Jackson, I have those books laying on hand that I like to hand out all the time. And having that digital copy, even if your county doesn't have that e-fields copy, being able to access it online. Kendall, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us before we wrap up today?
Yeah, Josh, as I evaluate my research that I've done and conversations that I've had following this, sometimes it can get a little bit controversial, especially when you're working with those ag retailers, right? No one wants to hear you should spend less on your fertilizer this year, especially when you're the retailer trying to sell that product. But that's not the story that I'm trying to paint here. I'm just trying to evaluate how can we be better stewards and make better nutrient management decisions as growers and as stewards truly of the environment, especially here in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And so some key points and key takeaways is that when we're looking for yield impact, we want to look for those low soil test phosphorus fields, and especially if you're in no-till systems, we want you to really evaluate those fields for maybe making those additional amendments and not holding back on those farms. I'd also really challenge and encourage any listener out there to use on-farm trials and really the data-driven decisions that have already been researched for you through some of the different resources we talked about earlier to make those decisions. I also want to encourage our listeners to use on-farm trials as an opportunity to make data-driven decisions. Sometimes we get concerned about, well, what impact is this really going to have on my farm? And so using the existing research that's already available to you can maybe help drive some of those decisions and make them a little bit easier for you. Those resources, again, are eFields reports, which you can find at go.osu.edu/efields, or those on-farm research reports, as I mentioned earlier, agcrops.osu.edu/on-farm-research. Really great resources for the grower and for the retailer as well to kind of understand where we're headed with some of this research practices. And my last key take-home message for the listener here is that conservation and profitability can go hand in hand. While our economics may not be as favorable, or the outlook from a marketing standpoint is maybe not favorable at this time, and for 2025, evaluating our nutrient management decisions and being good stewards of those nutrients can really help paint a better picture for us, and hopefully a brighter picture for us as we look at our 2025 farm profitability.
Thanks for listening today.
For more information about farm management tips, be sure to check out the Farm Office at farmoffice.osu.edu.